Far Cry games are famous for their stories, missions, and gunplay, and rightfully so. But what really gives each game its character, and the reason for the name of the series, is the setting. The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines Far Cry as a long distance, or something notably different. The settings of the Far Cry games are exotic, unique, and unfamiliar. I think this is the real key to what makes this series of games so much fun, the intrigue of discovery and the exploration of unknown territory. That's also why this aspect of Far Cry 6 is so important to the game's success. It needs a world that's fun, interesting, and even a little dangerous to explore. Far Cry 6 will be set in the fictional country of Yara, a Latin American island nation heavily inspired by Cuba. Yara's people and places already look incredibly interesting with a wide variety of landscapes that includes mountains, beaches, rivers, and jungles. Yara will also feature the capital city of Esperanza, which will be the first true urban landscape included in a Far Cry game. Because of the central importance of a good setting to the success of this game, and the ambitious breadth of Yara's varied terrain, I want to discuss vehicles, travel, and the world for Far Cry 6. The world of Yara will set the boundaries of gameplay in Far Cry 6, so we need to consider this aspect of the game before moving on to vehicles and travel. The most immediate and obvious characteristic of a game world is its size. Generally speaking, bigger is better, but with a few stipulations. Worlds that are gigantic but largely empty and lifeless are far worse than smaller worlds packed with interesting landmarks, people, and places. For example, Just Cause 3's world is one of the largest ever in an open-world game, nearly 10 times the playable area of GTA 5. But much of that world is empty space, whereas GTA is full of things to explore. Yara and Far Cry 6 will be the largest Far Cry world to date, but this only works if the world is truly interesting. The world needs to be as dense as it is large. There are several ways to make the world of Far Cry 6 fascinating, lush, and full. An important one is with the areas of interest across the map. Like the other Far Cry games, the 6th main entry is sure to feature vast and treacherous stretches of wilderness, but scattered within this area there will be structures, villages, towns, outposts, fortresses, and more. Every one of these locations should tell a story, or at least hint at one. Every piece of civilization you see, no matter how small or large, should make you want to ask, what happened here, or what can I learn about Yara from this place? Far Cry 4 did this particularly well, weaving the architecture and design of all its locations, even the smallest shack or most destitute cave, into a larger meta-narrative about the spirit of Kyrat. New Dawn also did this fairly successfully, using masterful post-apocalyptic map design to stir the player's curiosity and imagination about how things changed in the time between Far Cry 5's and New Dawn's events. Additionally, having a greater number of smaller, mostly insignificant areas of interest is a great way to make the world feel more complete without sacrificing its natural beauty. Far Cry 6 will feature guerrilla paths, which are trails carved in the landscape from past revolutions in Yara. In Far Cry 3 and 4, it was always fun to follow a suspicious-looking trail or narrow mountain path and be led to an ancient temple or ominous cave that looked like it had never been explored. The more hidden paths, trails, and out-of-the-way locations in Far Cry 6, the better, and fortunately, it looks like Ubisoft's world designers have kept this in mind. In addition to the world feeling full, it also needs to feel alive. Enemies stationed on the side of the road, set pieces in certain locations, and random events such as skirmishes or supply truck raids create the sense that something is always happening. The world is at its best when it has the capacity to distract the player from his main objective for hours while still having fun the whole time. For me, Far Cry 4 is the perfect example of this. I would set out to complete a certain objective, only to realize 2 hours later that I had completely forgotten what I was doing and was nowhere close to where I had intended to be. And the best part was always that I didn't feel mad because I had still enjoyed myself the whole time I was sidetracked. Far Cry 6 aims to create this feeling with scattered checkpoints, F&D bases, and military patrols, as well as what lead gameplay designer David Gravel described as the notoriety system. As he puts it in an interview with GameRant, if you push the world will push back. Constantly ambushing Yaran military soldiers, taking advantage of the holstering mechanic to stage surprise attacks, and blowing your stealth cover will cause enemies to recognize you faster and fight back against you harder. This live response to the player's actions is exactly the kind of mechanic Far Cry 6 needs, and I'm very glad David and the developers are including it. Lastly, as a general rule, the developer should be mindful that the world does much of the work to set the mood. Everything from the color palette to the state of the physical infrastructure invokes certain feelings and expectations for the player. Designers have to be aware of this. Additionally, the way that areas of interest flow with the wilderness is exceedingly important. Do they blend in with the surroundings, causing a barely noticeable disruption, like a damp underground cave in Far Cry 4? Or do they jut out in stark contrast to the natural world as a symbol of power and prestige, like a fortress? These characteristics set the tone for the events within each location and can totally change the mood of the game based on their design. Recent Far Cry games have been inconsistent at best in this regard, but a good example of world design done well is the difference between the Whitetail Mountains and the Holland Valley regions in Far Cry 5. In the mountains, the color palette gets darker, the forest gets thicker, and the wildlife becomes more dangerous, reflecting the more serious tone of the characters and narrative in that part of the world. In an interview with Game Rant, lead world designer Ben Hall describes the sensations that players feel as they experience the contrast between Yara's decaying urban environments and the natural landscape. Far Cry 6's world needs to pay a lot of attention to the tone it sets, and make sure it matches the events that unfold so that it creates a consistent mood for the player. Since Far Cry 2, each successive main entry in the Far Cry series has introduced new vehicles, new traversal options, and expanded fast travel capabilities. As a result, traveling around the world has never been easier, and the game is now focused less on deep immersion in the setting, and more on getting as quickly as possible to the next piece of action, nearly eliminating the element of strategy and planning that went into getting from point A to point B in past Far Cry titles. The travel and vehicles in Far Cry 6 need to disrupt this trend, with the goal of making traveling through the world of Yara more difficult, but also more rewarding. Before I discuss exactly how to do that, it's important to note that more difficult doesn't necessarily mean the world should be physically harder to traverse, such as having unscalable mountains or slower vehicles. Rather, it means that covering large distances very quickly just to skip to the next objective should be less feasible than it has been in recent games like Far Cry 5. Also, an extremely important qualifying condition to this idea is that making travel more difficult doesn't work if the world isn't interesting and fun to explore. If it's boring or empty, then trying to make travel more strategic and thoughtful will only lead to a frustrating and tedious experience. The open world doesn't have to, and shouldn't, be bustling with non-stop action and enemies and gunfights, but it should always offer the player something fascinating in between the actual objectives and activities to complete. One of the most impactful mechanical changes that can be made to Far Cry 6 deals with the fast travel system. In every Far Cry game, fast traveling has been free, and since Far Cry 2 the number of fast travel points has expanded dramatically. In Far Cry 5 and New Dawn, virtually every location on the map could be used as a fast travel point, and once the required perk was unlocked, the player could even airdrop from fast travel points, which made nearly 100% of the map accessible via fast travel. Unfortunately, the availability of so many fast travel options strongly discouraged physically traveling around the map, and players no longer had to plan ahead about where they were going, how they were going to get there, or how long it would take. We don't yet know how fast travel in Far Cry 6 will work, but suffice to say it should be significantly scaled back. The number of locations should be limited, perhaps just to guerrilla camps or to locations connected by guerrilla trails that the player has discovered. There should also be an in-game currency cost to fast traveling, which could be reduced and eventually made free by a series of perks. These changes will reduce the amount of map area that can be accessed via fast travel, and will force players to consider fast traveling as part of their budget decisions, just like they would decide whether to buy a new gun or what perks to invest their skill points in, especially in the early game. Ultimately, the goal of any changes to fast travel should be to encourage more physical exploration of the world, which should lead to greater immersion in and appreciation of the setting. Additionally, airdropping should become its own separate system. You should be able to call in an airdrop from anywhere, but it requires some sort of token, one that's different from the regular currency used to buy store items. For example, this token could be called flares, and they might only be found in certain locations, rare chests, or given out as rewards for a certain type of side mission. Airdropping should only be available in regions in which all of the Yarn military's flak cannons have been destroyed, but once available, you should be able to teleport and airdrop anywhere in the region, not just fast travel points. When tuned correctly, this system should be a late-game convenience that feels well-earned, not a crutch that can be used very early on to avoid more tedious forms of travel. In other words, the cost of airdropping should more appropriately match the reward. The next changes to travel that should be made in Far Cry 6 revolve around the relative difficulty of getting around. It hasn't been difficult to travel since Far Cry 2, but Far Cry 6 seems to be changing the formula a little bit. There will now be more checkpoints, roadblocks, turret locations, etc. that may impede the player's movement, and it appears that you might have to engage in bribery or discover alternate routes in order to get through to some protected locations. The world doesn't have to be jam-packed with these points to make this work, just enough to fulfill the goal of making the player think and plan more strategically about moving across the map, without being so frustrating as to make them want to stop traveling at all. Additionally, the amount of resistance the player faces will vary by region. Some areas are natural strongholds for enemies, such as the capital city, Esperanza, while others will naturally be safer, such as Isla Santuario, the smaller island shown in the bottom left of the world map here. Finally, it's not clear how the map will actually be uncovered in Far Cry 6. It's doubtful that the bell towers of 3 and 4 are returning, but we don't know if the fog clearing system from Far Cry 6 and New Dawn will be coming back either. The developers have promised that the player will be able to go anywhere he or she wants at any time in the game. There are no parts of the map that need to be unlocked first, but there isn't any information beyond that. Personally, I like the system introduced in Far Cry 5, but I also think there's potential for the developers to get creative with the guerrilla camps and paths, and I look forward to seeing what they have in store for us. The approach to vehicles in Far Cry 6 should be the same as the approach to travel more generally. Using vehicles should be fun and rewarding, providing a sense of accomplishment. In Far Cry 5, the worst offenders to this philosophy were flying vehicles. Planes and helicopters were relatively easy to obtain, were owned permanently once purchased, and could travel across the entire map in mere minutes while facing zero resistance. Planes and helicopters will be back in Far Cry 6, but with a twist. The Yaran military now has flat cannons set up across the whole country, which will shoot down any flying vehicle that comes within their range. In order to safely operate a plane or helicopter, you'll need to first take out all of the flat cannons on the ground by disabling them with EMP grenades, destroying them with explosives, or killing their operators. Additionally, there will be a dune buggy in the game that's equipped with a gliding parachute that allows it to temporarily take flight. At first, I was worried that this would serve as a risk-free replacement to traditional flying vehicles, but I asked David Gravel if the flat cannons would target the buggy when it was in flying mode, and he confirmed to me that they would. I think this series of changes will result in a much better balance for flying vehicles, although I am admittedly still curious about how they will be unlocked and whether they are owned permanently as they were in Far Cry 5. Potentially even more exciting than the changes to aerial vehicles are the changes and additions to Far Cry 6's grounded ones. There looks to be a very wide range of resolver vehicles, and players will be able to customize them both aesthetically and functionally, including adding armor and weaponry. Additionally, a system called Guerrilla Rides will allow the player to own a personal vehicle that they can have delivered to them on demand nearly anywhere in Yara. I like this enhanced sense of ownership and customization, and I'm excited for the range of offerings in Far Cry 6. From 1960s American sport cars to modified off-roaders and large trucks. These each will have their different benefits and disadvantages depending on your chosen playstyle and the type of terrain you're in, which will be a nice change from recent games where the vehicles all pretty much felt the same because the landscape varied so little. As for water-based vehicles like boats and jet skis, we've seen the usual assortment of armed speedboats and patrol cruisers, but there also seem to be a few larger ships like fishing trawlers and tankers. It's unclear whether we'll be able to operate these as a player, and I somewhat doubt that we will, but the vast expanse of water between the two main islands of Yara raises some questions about water traversal. It does make me wonder how Far Cry 6 will help us cross the open ocean in some areas. Finally, in the vein of non-traditional vehicles, we haven't seen much yet other than the aforementioned flying buggy. However, I think Far Cry 6 should bring back the hovercraft from Far Cry 4, which was mostly impractical but fast and fun to drive. In other words, it would be perfect for a Resolver-inspired adaptation in this upcoming game. Additionally, hang gliders should return to the series after inexplicably going missing in Far Cry 5. These could be a great in-between method of travel that's less practical than a true aerial vehicle, but safer due to the fact that flat cannons do not target you in gliding. The last element of travel that I think is worth briefly touching on is player movement. Running around without vehicles often feels slow and boring in Far Cry games, and I think a few changes would improve this. Perks that could improve the base sprint speed of the player would be a well-balanced quality of life improvement, and with the new gear system in Far Cry 6 that gives you temporary bonuses depending on what equipment and clothing you're wearing, a pair of boots or pants that boost movement speed could be the perfect solution to this problem. Additionally, the ability to hip-fire your weapon while sliding or mantling would improve the feel of guns blazing combat, and make the movement more fluid overall, while the ability to go prone and lay flat on your stomach would be a good stealth addition to the game. All of these abilities could be tied to the gear system for balancing purposes, and I look forward to trying out a movement-based loadout, since narrative director Naveed Kavari confirmed that players will be able to save multiple loadouts of gear and weapons to swap between seamlessly when the situation calls for it. The world of Yara looks extremely promising, and I can't wait to begin my exploration of this paradise that's collapsing from the inside. But this is an aspect of the game that's absolutely crucial to get right, and making sure the world design, vehicles, and travel systems all work in harmony will be a difficult task. These elements are what give Far Cry its name, and they will either make or break Far Cry 6. Ultimately, we'll only find out if Yara lives up to its potential on October 7th later this year. Until then, be sure to subscribe for more content analyzing the design and gameplay of Far Cry 6, and let me know what you think in the comments. Whether you agree, disagree, have questions, or have suggestions for future videos, I look forward to reading what you say. Lastly, I want to thank everyone who's already subscribed, as this channel just reached 500 subscribers after the most recent video. As always, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.